Welcome to the Quickstart Problem Solving, Part 4, the hands-on exercise. This is the first release of this material. As time goes on, I plan to fine-tune what's here and add additional tools. If you have any improvements or additions you'd like to suggest, please send them to the email address shown here. In this session, we're going to practice the A3 problem-solving method, along with many specific problem-solving tools. So fasten your seatbelts. Here are starting points for each section of the exercise, so you can stop and restart anytime you like. You'll need several sheets of blank paper, a pen or pencil, some sticky notes, or just small pieces of paper and tape, and 2 downloadable PDF forms, an example A3 and a blank template. You'll find these and other useful tools on the exercise launch page in a downloadable PDF called Lean Agile NGO Problem Solving Tools. If you don't have access to a printer, don't worry, you can do all of this with a blank sheet of paper. In the Fundamentals to Problem Solving module, you may recall we mentioned Albert Einstein's comment that if he had 1 hour to solve an important problem, he would spend the first 55 minutes thinking about the problem, figuring out the right questions to ask, and the last 5 minutes solving it. The basic pattern and rhythm is PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act. The paradox of doing this right is summed up in a classic Lean phrase: we must slow down to speed up. And the A3 method can help us do that in any situation. The A3 is the most widely used problem-solving method in the Lean community. It is a one-page storyboard summary of a problem-solving journey. It helps teams stay on track, step by step, not jumping to conclusions, staying focused on what is most important. We'll walk through these steps during the exercise. In my opinion, the best source of learning for the A3 is the book Managing to Learn by John Shook, which tells the parallel stories of a problem-solving journey through the eyes of a coach and the learner as they encounter and overcome common challenges and thinking errors. Here's a learning tip to a video by John where he helps you understand the foundations of this thinking process. During this session, we'll be using the A3 example for Managing to Learn. It contains useful prompts for each session. You can download the template from the exercise launch page. The A3 journey starts by defining the problem and determining the right points of view and people needed to solve it. Then you examine the current condition, what's happening now, by looking at the evidence and the data. Then you describe what you want it to be, called the target condition, and you figure out the differences between current and future state, often called the gaps. Then you analyze the problem. What's keeping you from reaching your target? When you identify what you think is a root cause, you formulate hypotheses and design experiments to test it. And you determine how to measure the results and what the results should look like if your hypothesis is correct. That's all planning. Then you rapidly test, measure, reflect, take appropriate action, and begin the cycle again. That's Do, Check, Act, the last 5 minutes of Einstein's hour. This can all be done quickly if it's what I like to call a 10-minute problem, or if you've broken a larger problem down into smaller chunks. Here's the A3 template for Managing to Learn with prompts at each step. I'll also provide a blank form for you to use during this exercise. If you have access to a printer, you may want to keep a copy beside you, and you'll also want to print the blank to use during the exercise, or just use a blank sheet of paper. That works too. Now that I've shown you how the A3 storyboard works, remember it's more than just a form to be filled out, a box to be checked to say, we did that. The A3 is a disciplined thinking process. It guides individuals, teams, and organizations to slow down in order to speed up. An A3 can be done on a napkin, or a piece of paper. Some organizations even create pocket-sized cards for everyone to carry around and pull out anytime they need it. There's a copy of this pocket card template in the tools you've downloaded. I always carry a small stack of full-size blank A3s with me when visiting with clients. At any time, I may quietly pull one out, and they may not know I'm doing it. Later, when I'm able to replay their situation to them, framing and organizing it in a new way, it can sometimes help stimulate their thinking. When I do this, I'm careful not to solve the problem for them. Coaches should never do that, any more than a football coach should run onto the field and kick a goal for their team. My goal is to help them learn how to solve it for themselves. In an organization where this practice isn't widely known, I may start with a blank whiteboard. I won't tell the team what I'm doing, and I won't even use the term A3. I just start asking questions, facilitating a discussion. I might start with an icebreaker like, why are we all here? That's usually good for a spirited discussion and will surely draw out various viewpoints like, I have no idea, or I don't want to be here, I have work to do, along with various, often conflicting perspectives on the problem, often followed by why it's somebody else's fault and why they haven't fixed it by now, and so on. After that warm-up, which feeds the background step 1, by the way, then I may move on to tell me more about the problem. That often triggers a gusher of opinions and pent-up energy. When people describe uncomfortable symptoms, be sympathetic, but keep probing. It's like a doctor who pokes and probes at an injury. He's very sympathetic while he manipulates it, trying to understand what's going on. After a while, I may say something like, how do we know that? Followed by, what evidence do we have? Suddenly, people may open their laptops or scurry to their offices or work areas to get pieces of paper from their walls or artifacts from the process. I may spontaneously lead them on a problem walk. Go see it for real. As you've probably figured out, we're now in step 2, current condition. During this step, John Shook asks 3 questions that often open people's minds up. What do we know? What do we think we know, but we can't prove? What do we need to know that we currently don't? If it's a big problem, getting through a first pass on current condition may be enough for the first session. By this time, though, usually something has begun to happen. Rather than resisting or holding fast to the opinion there isn't a problem or blaming others, the curtain starts to pull away. Hey, maybe this is a problem, and maybe it's more complicated than we thought, and just maybe we can solve it together. They go from being a reluctant crowd in a room to thinking and acting like a team. Everyone may leave the room with a new energy and an assignment to go digging for more data and evidence for the next session. Most teams find that no matter how much time you spend in current condition on the first pass, as the journey continues, you return here again and again with more data, evidence, and insights. During the exercise, you'll experience each step and we'll explore this further. Once an organization widely adopts A3s, they start showing up everywhere in team spaces, workflow areas, and in visual rooms where people meet. Here's a big visual room at Toyota headquarters in Brussels. There are over 20 rooms like this in the building where all team meetings are held. Over half of the visuals you see on the walls here are A3 storyboards. Here's a similar big visual room at Nike headquarters in Amsterdam, where A3s are widely used. And here's a big visual room at ING Bank headquarters, also in Amsterdam. A3s and Kata were a daily practice here as well. Several years ago, ING entirely remodeled their offices to accommodate such visual, collaborative team spaces. Then a few years later, the pandemic struck, and ING pivoted to adapt to teams working remotely with more digital visual support. The lesson they learned here? Be flexible. Large NGOs can be particularly challenging in this way since their programs and projects, offices, teams, partners, and volunteers often span the globe. Conditions can change quickly in the field, and they require rapid response. Electronic collaboration, communication, and knowledge management, including visual management, are necessary. With that said, when a localized team or individual has an opportunity to put up physical visual management in their workspace, such as a Kanban or Scrum board, problem-solving boards, operating metrics, and so on, it creates a cognitively richer experience conducive to interaction and learning. So do your best in your own situation with what you have. Here's one last thought before we start the exercise. An organization's history of problem solving can become valuable institutional knowledge and intellectual property. When a team begins a new problem solving journey, one of the first things they may do is ask the question, has someone already solved this problem? And if so, what can we learn from them? Do we need to do ours differently, or can we standardize what they've done and eliminate non-value adding variation across the organization? So I usually recommend the organization maintain a library containing the history of all A3s and supporting information. Here's a caution though. It's important that the team doesn't take the easy way out and jump to a solution by using what someone else has done. They need to look at their problem carefully and see what may be different. If they come up with a useful variation on what earlier teams have done, that's valuable new knowledge to be shared across the organization. This is a tangible step towards becoming a learning organization, which is to actively gather and share all lessons learned. So let's begin the exercise. Our first step is to select a problem. I always encourage people to choose a real problem for two reasons. First, choosing a fictional problem means that you get to make it up as you go along. The data and evidence don't represent the real sort of problems you'll encounter, and believe me, real problems have dimensions and root causes that you often don't anticipate until you encounter them. And second, choosing a real problem challenges you to dig deep, beyond what you know, to what you think you know but may not be true, and finally to what you don't know but you need to know. That's the journey. Now I suggest you don't choose a really hard problem at first, or if you do, take it through step 4, problem analysis, where you break it down into chunks. Then repeat the process from the beginning, digging deeper into one of the elements of the bigger problem. That's how it usually works when tackling large problems, and if you have the time, this experience can be really mind-opening. It's up to you. With this video, you have the opportunity to stop and restart as often as you like. So be bold, choose wisely, and if you discover you don't make the best choice of problem for some reason, that's okay too. If you learn something along the way, that's one for the win column. Now grab a piece of paper and write your problem at the top. Pause the video by pressing the pause button on your YouTube console. Take your time. I'll wait patiently as long as it takes while you get ready for the next step. Press play when you're ready to go again. Welcome back. Now look carefully at what you've written. Pretend someone else wrote this and you're seeing it for the first time. What does it say about the problem? Is it a factual account? Is it full of emotion? Is there an implied solution buried in the statement, like you already know what the problem is and what you should do about it? Does it subtly point to whatever or whoever is to blame? Does it repeat the stories you've already played over and over in your head again and again about the problem? These are all common tendencies that we need to learn to work with. As I explained in the overview section of this exercise, reaching agreement on a first draft of a problem statement is usually a great icebreaker for a team. Welcome back. Now look carefully at what you've written. Pretend someone else wrote this and you're seeing it for the first time. What does it say about the problem? Is it a factual account? Is it full of emotion? Is there an implied solution buried in the statement, like you already know what the problem is and what you should do about it? Does it subtly point to whatever or whoever is to blame? Does it repeat the stories you've already played over and over in your head again and again about the problem? These are all common tendencies that we need to learn to work with. As I explained in the overview section of this exercise, reaching agreement on a first draft of a problem statement is usually a great icebreaker for a team. Here are two templates. They may help you craft a good problem statement. There are many questions listed between these two templates. Just understand that a good problem statement should be a soundbite, a useful heuristic. It should be no more than perhaps 50 memorable words, but it should say a lot and it should leave a mark. Here's a real problem statement from a real A3 from a large NGO I worked with years ago. I've made this story anonymous, but I feel it's reflective of the challenges many large NGOs face. In summary, they had several divisions that did similar work in different areas. Each division had its own way of doing things that were reasonably effective, but they were inconsistent. This made it difficult for people to move around within the organization or to lend a hand when someone from another division needed help. And when a customer worked with several of these divisions over time, it became quite apparent that they were not consistent. It was confusing, often inefficient, and frankly, it didn't look good for the organization, which had a hard time learning and progressing together. Here's the problem statement they came up with. Now take one last look at your problem statement, then let's move on to the next step of the exercise. Pause the video if you wish. Now let's move to current condition. I suggest you start with a quick brainstorm. Take a few minutes to record all of your observations, opinions, and emotions that come to mind about the current situation. You can use a sheet of paper, but it's better if you write each item on a sticky note so you can sort and group them later. Get it all out. You may feel a sense of relief once you get all of this on paper for the first time. You may also have one of those aha moments where you suddenly see something in a new way. This can be really powerful, but don't be fooled by this feeling into thinking you've found a solution yet. If you're working with a group of people on this exercise, consider having a sticky storm session. You'll find a detailed description of how to run a sticky storm in the Quickstart Kanban module. So pause the video now. After you feel like you're done, then restart. Now that you've completed your first iteration and captured what we call your beginner's mind perspective on the problem, let's go deeper into what makes a good problem statement. It helps us grasp the situation, understand what the problem is, why it's important, who's affected by it, the impact, as well as the potential value of the solution. There's often a diversity of viewpoints to a problem, from large to small or small to large. How you see the problem and where you start depends on your point of view. If you're on the front lines, you might just see the tip of the iceberg. Your view of the problem is limited to what you see and experience. The challenge you may face is to understand, through the analysis process, how the problem you're experiencing may be ultimately caused by something you don't see or don't even know about. How do you anticipate aspects of the problem you don't know about? The best way is to invite representatives of all the dimensions into the room or onto the Zoom session to define and solve the problem together. If a problem suddenly appears, you may need to start right away. Gather whoever you can and get started. You may need a quick intervention just to stop the bleeding, but don't leave that intervention in place and think you've solved the problem any more than putting your finger into a leaking dike prevents the eventual flood. On the other hand, if you're starting near the top of the organization, looking at the big picture, you may have plenty of ideas about what the problem is, what's causing it, and what to do about it. It may be so complex that you don't know where to start. Maybe your organization has tried to solve this before and it didn't work or it didn't stick. Now's the time to practice a little humility. What you think you know is usually a little or a lot wrong. As the old saying goes, yes, I mentioned this in part 2, but it bears repeating. Confidence is the feeling you have before you fully understand the situation. The higher you go in an organization, the broader the view and the thinner the air. If you don't actively open yourself up, you're likely leading and making strategic decisions from inside a bubble. But a challenge for many leaders and managers is letting people know that you don't know the answer. In many cultures, that's a sign of weakness. Get over it. Get out there. Lead by example. Make it safe not to know. Be vulnerable. Be curious. Go see, ask why, show respect. Here's a list of methods that are often useful for grasping the situation and understanding the current condition. They can be as simple as 5 whys, which we explored in the Fundamentals of Value Stream Flow Chalk Talk, or they can be elaborate, like a full-scale value stream analysis. It depends on the problem. We'll cover a few of these methods in this exercise, and I'll add more in the future. But first, let's take another look at your current condition. If the problem you're working on is really important to you, you may choose to do another iteration. Go around again with what you've recorded so far. Look through each of your sticky notes and make a note about what evidence or data you have to support it. How do you prove what you think you know? And what do you need to know that you don't? Are there conflicting opinions on some of these? Especially if the viewpoints are from several team members, then give them each the benefit of the doubt. This is a good time to exercise a rule of brainstorming. No judgment. Every idea contains a clue. Later, you can examine them to see if they're valid or if they contain a distortion. Consider ranking your ideas, possibly with a colored dot in the corner of the top 5 or 10 sticky notes that best represent the problem, and then summarize them by writing them on your A3 in the current condition area. When you're done, you could compile the list of potential sources for evidence. Depending on how much time you want to spend on this exercise, and if this information is readily available, gather it now, or leave a note for yourself to gather it later. As you continue through the rest of the A3 process, it's likely you'll keep thinking of more issues and more sources of data. Write everything down. You can't afford to lose any insights. This is why people often carry little stacks of sticky notes with them wherever they go. Now go ahead and pause the video and work through this if you feel it's worth the additional time. Then restart. And whether or not you do this on the exercise, remember it's important to work through current state more than once because your thinking evolves as more evidence emerges. Now let's take a look at a few more tools that might help you understand your current state even better. Let's begin with the customer because the first principle of Lean, written in the original book Lean Thinking, is to focus on what the customer values. Two popular ways of talking about this are listening to the voice of the customer and understanding the customer experience. There are many sophisticated voice of customer techniques you could use when appropriate. But first, why don't you start by just going to Gemba and ask them, or spend a little time observing them to see what they do. You can do that by sitting in their office and watching them, or walk the process with them if they don't mind. Or if you're working online, as long as you protect their privacy, you can observe hundreds, thousands, or even millions of customer experiences at once with some basic analytics. One technique that many organizations have settled on is a simple technique called Net Promoter Score. How many times have you been asked in a survey, how likely are you to recommend us to a friend on a scale of 1 to 10? Apparently, the answer to this simple question evokes a degree of thoughtfulness and truth from most people that is often equivalent to more sophisticated research techniques, and you can gather some really useful insights. Here's a popular heuristic. For anyone 6 and below, you might conduct a deeper investigation to look for problems. It's pretty common that when someone reaches a degree of satisfaction like a 3 or a 4, They may not even respond to the question. They may just ignore you. You may need to find an alternative way to reach the people who don't respond. When you reach them, you may find they're cynical or openly hostile. Does it sound like fun to try and reach these people and talk with them? It's not. But they're the people you need to talk to the most, and they can become your most active promoters if you can turn them around and believe that you're making steps to improve. Another popular voice of customer tool is called a customer journey map. I'll present a separate session on this tool because it can be very sophisticated if you need it to be. This is my favorite example of why a customer journey map doesn't need to be sophisticated to get the point across. This is a photo of the South Mall of the Smithsonian Museum Complex in the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C. It's an amazing place to visit if you can, with 19 world-class museums and a zoological park in one place, and much of it is free. It's incredible, but it can also be overwhelming. How to help each visitor make the most of their visit? First, you need to understand their journey so you can provide them with support along the way. I suggest you pause the video and really study this map. Now let's switch from the customer experience view and journey to the internal process view by taking a deeper look at the process of how we deliver value to our customers. You often need to start by carefully defining what the process is, where it starts and where it ends, what's involved, and so forth. You may be surprised how many differing opinions may arise with these simple questions. Consider having another sticky storming session before you dig into any kind of mapping. This is more planning, and the more good ideas you get out at the front end means less rework and dead ends you'll have to face later. There's a simple way to define a process. It's called a SIPOC, which stands for Supplier, Inputs, Process, Outputs, and Customer. To this list, I like to add information sources and uses. Here's an example of a SIPOC for making breakfast, with plenty of elements about making breakfast that you could investigate more deeply to assess the current condition. Here's an anonymous example from a large financial institution years ago. You may not recognize the terminology, but they did, and this very simple diagram was a good way to launch a very complex redesign project. Here's a SIPOC template that's on the Downloadable Tools PDF on the exercise launch page. You can use this template or just grab a sheet of paper or a whiteboard and some sticky notes and do this as a team. Once you've identified the components of the process, do a mental problem walk. What problems occur with each piece? These can provide important inputs for your current condition analysis, a roadmap to collect evidence and data to better understand the problems, which will be helpful in the A3 Step 4, problem analysis. And here's one more little tip you may have encountered if you've viewed the Kanban Quickstart exercise. If you're using stickies to build your SIPOC, grab some pink stickies for the problems. If you feel a SIPOC might be helpful in this stage of your exercise, go ahead and pause the video and work on it. I'll be waiting for you. Now let's talk about value stream mapping, much more involved than a SIPOC, and it may be the next step if your problem needs this level of detail. In the Introduction to Value Stream Flow video, we explored various types of value stream maps. They can look very different depending on how they're used. Here's a view of a classic value stream map which looks at a manufacturing process. As we already explained in the Fundamentals of Value Stream Flow video, value stream mapping can apply in any industry or situation. Here's a learning link to a short Gemba Academy video that explains how. The important thing to consider here is that a value stream map records the steps in a process, the information sources and uses that support it, along with specific data on each step. Process time, how long it takes to do each task, lead time, the elapsed time before moving to the next step, and quality, the percentage of failures where the task needs to be redone. There are more potential data points that you can capture, but these three, process time, lead time, and quality, are often enough to understand how the process flows, where it doesn't, why, and the impact. Consider this example where a process uses 23 minutes of process time or work time to complete, but the total elapsed time, the amount of time the customer has to wait for the result, is 4 hours and 12 minutes. Just looking at these two numbers alone can give you an idea of how much waste in terms of delay is built into the process. You'll have to dig a little deeper to figure out where and why these delays occur. But in this case, here's a clue. Look at the quality statistic, also known as first pass yield. In this example, only 32% of the time does work pass entirely through this process without any errors. That could explain a lot about why the elapsed time is so high, dealing with errors, taking corrective action, and so on. All this work on poor quality is known as failure demand and shows you how much good time people waste on bad processes. Sometimes it's best to start with a SIPOC if the process isn't clear. Gather a group of people and sticky storm the SIPOC pieces as an icebreaker, then take a mental problem walk through it to see if you need to go further. A value stream map can help you see the flow using data to identify where and why it's breaking down, where a SIPOC doesn't do that. Remember that both the SIPOC and the value stream map don't solve problems. They help you find, assess, and prioritize them to find the problem you should solve first. Many of you have heard of the Pareto principle, also known as the 80-20 rule, which is actually a heuristic, not a rule, that finding and fixing the right problem, the root cause, can fix a surprisingly large number of symptoms and related problems. We'll return to this idea when we're ready to move from problem analysis into experimentation. We explored this map in part 2 where someone gets their car repaired. There's a swim lane for customer experience and a parallel swim lane for supplier process. This approach helps to identify specific problems from both the customer experience and supplier process perspectives. These are what I sometimes call moments of truth along the way. This approach also helps to identify failure demand, unnecessary workload caused by problems, rework, and so on. It's common to see over 50% of the workload is failure demand. Through countless experiences, Lean practitioners have come to understand that most processes have a tremendous amount of available capacity buried by waste, which points out the importance of eliminating waste and improving processes as a first step to adding capacity, rather than hiring more people, buying more equipment, building out more physical space, or purchasing more software. To wrap up this step of the exercise, here's the current condition from the anonymous large NGO example. Since this was the organization's first effort at continuous improvement across their divisions, they chose their intake process, the review, selection, and proposal of grant opportunities, as a low-risk, high-impact step to experiment and learn. We assembled a small team from each division, put them in a very large room together for a week, where they individually mapped out their processes. Then each division team presented their process to the entire group. Then they understood each other's processes, which led to some very interesting discussions. Finally, they consolidated all of their individual maps into a single collective one with pink stickies representing all the problems. Here's a photo of that map. You may notice that this is not a SIPOC or a value stream map. It's a high-level process flow with major contributors represented as what are called horizontal swim lanes. The next step for this team was to identify a target state and prioritize the problems they needed to solve to get there. Now take a moment. What do you really see here? Looks like a wall of pink stickies to me. This was a successful step for the teams that produced it because it helped them see all of the problems they struggled with each day, and it gave them a sense of confidence that they could solve them together. To do that, though, they needed organizational support from leadership. And by bringing senior leadership into the room later and sharing this board, they were able to make the case that this was worth doing. As you record your current condition, you face many decisions. How much detail do you capture? How much detail do you display on the form? How much of it is a verbal narrative? How many charts, tables, voice of customer images, SciPox value stream maps? How do they communicate the situation at a glance, which is the purpose of the A3? Remember that there will always be layers and layers of supporting detail beneath the A3 storyboard view on diagrams, spreadsheets, and documents on a wall and in a network hard drive. Now go ahead and pause the video if you want to make any last changes to your current condition or leave yourself reminders to make changes later. Then let's move on. Now let's move to A3 Step 3, Target Condition. This is where we define where we want to go. Some people like to ask the question, what does good look like? Let's start with a brief discussion of the purpose of the target condition. Better yet, let's start with what it is not. The target condition isn't used for reward and punishment. It's not a goal or a quota. It's not the carrot and the stick. Why? If I were to give you a goal and tell you I would reward you handsomely if you achieved it and punish you severely if you missed it, what would you do? Would you consider the consequences on others? Consequences on the good of the overall organization and its customers? Most likely you would consider these, but what would you do? Sadly, many people feel they have no choice. If they would lose their job, their family would suffer if they didn't go along. This is a problem with the organization culture and mindset, and in such a situation, people may not have a choice. So we must learn to think differently as an organization, as leadership, about what a target really is. It's where we want to go, but we may not know how to get there. We don't know how long it will take, what obstacles we'll encounter, what we'll do about them. We discussed this in part 2. It's like crossing a jungle or a swamp filled with alligators and other hazards, or it's like crossing a dark room with the lights out. You don't just walk confidently, you end up with a bruised leg or worse. You pick your way along, step by step. That's how this works, and with each step we adjust for the next. That's PDCA. Organizations that really believe this encourage, support, recognize, and reward people and teams for solving problems the right way, for learning, and ultimately developing the capability to overcome any obstacle in a safe way. A healthy problem-solving culture supports everyone, making it psychologically safe to move slightly beyond their comfort zone into the learning zone where all progress is made. But it's important to keep them away from the fear and danger zone. That's the role of the manager, or ideally the coach, to help them look over the edge, but prevent them from going over the cliff. So the next question about target state is the time horizon. Should your target be long or short term? The simple answer is both. The general direction we're heading is our strategic intent, guided by our true north. Once we've defined our true north, leadership may set a challenge, maybe a one-year goal. This is far enough out to be a stretch, but not so far out, like 3 or 5 years, to be more of a vision than a target. Customers like challenges that paint a realistic view of the near future. It gives them confidence, invites them to offer you feedback to help you get there. It declares your intention to serve them better. Now the team must decide how to get there safely as they venture into the learning zone while avoiding the fear and danger zone. This is where the target condition comes into play. In this example, it's shown here as a 90-day target. That's how many companies operate, using both Hoshin-Conry and OKRs, two popular management system methods we discussed in part 2. Both have formal organizational check and act milestones each calendar quarter. But in a situation where things change very quickly, like the high-tech industry, targets may be set monthly or even shorter. In the Scrum method, which we'll discuss shortly, sprints are often in 2-week increments, and the team's target condition is defined by the backlog items they select for that particular sprint cycle. This is not to say that you should take a week or 2 weeks or 3 months to solve a particular problem. Small problems take much less. Large problems take much more. Just remember, each iteration towards the solution should be done quickly so you can make a rapid step forward. And it's usually important to keep a team on a regular cadence, no matter what they're doing at the moment. Just keep moving. Don't tackle too many variables at once. Let the energy and momentum of fast little steps keep them moving forward. Once they have a target, they don't just boldly march into a swamp. They need to be informed by the problems and obstacles that lie ahead. And that's what step 4, problem analysis, which is coming next, is all about. When we define the target condition, we must do it in terms of the context of the problem, what we need to know about it, what we need to learn, and what we need to communicate to others. This may be a simple narrative like this, if it's clear. It may be done visually, like this hand-drawn value stream map of a veterinary practice. Notice that the current condition map is on the top and the target condition is on the bottom, making it easy for everyone to compare them and to intuitively understand the next step. Or it may be illustrated with data and charts like this in order to create testable hypotheses and measure the results. Use whatever is appropriate for the situation and the audience. Make it as simple and graspable as possible. If you need specific details that don't fit on the primary A3 form, keep them in supplementary materials that viewers can access as needed. Here's the target condition from the anonymous large NGO example. The group identified the similarities and differences among each division's process. Their target state was to bring consistency, efficiency, and scale across all of its divisions. The differences that added value were adopted as a target process by everyone. The differences that represented something unique for any one particular division were called value-adding variation and were kept in their particular target. And the differences that didn't add value were called non-value-adding variation and were targeted for elimination. By the end of the week, they had designed a target state map representing the practices that would be organization-wide, supplemented by division-specific variations where appropriate. You'll note 2 things about this target state. First, it's just a narrative. I have not shared the detailed data analytics that were included in this current condition assessment. But if you had stepped in the room after that session, you would have been cognitively immersed in it, and it worked. Second, this target state not only defines the target condition, but also the hypothesis testing and deployment process they intended to use. That doesn't usually happen in the target state, but in this case, charting out the way forward was something the team had to agree on together, so they made it part of the target. You may recall from part 3 the importance of stabilizing a process before you can start improving it. This example of the large anonymous NGO shows how it looks in practice. The teams first understood, grasping the situation, that using different processes across divisions was serving no one, not them, not their customers. So they decided to stabilize the situation. The teams visualized their processes. and then they standardized them, agreeing on what to stop doing and what to do in a more standardized way. Finally, they'd identified a stable baseline target upon which they could adopt together, learn and improve together going forward. This was an enormous step and a highly visible sign to everyone that it could be done in this organization. In such a large situation as this one I just described, even if the team was unable to reach a collective stable process by the 90-day target, that would not be a failure. If it took longer, it would likely be for a good reason, and those obstacles in the swamp would be sorted out in good time. But in my experience, once a team sees a target for the future and understands how much better their lives will be for it, they will reach it if the rest of the organization supports them. Now it's time for the next step in your exercise to create your vision for the future of your problem. What does your true north say about where you want to be someday? If you're working in a group and each person is working on a separate A3, once you've all crafted your vision statements, consider sharing them one by one. It's very likely that the questions you're asked and the dialogue that results will significantly improve the clarity and the quality of your statements. So go ahead and pause the video and restart when you're done with your vision statement. Welcome back. Now it's time for your target condition. Depending on the nature of your problem and your expectations of how difficult it might be to solve, set your target horizon appropriately. Do you think this is a one-day problem? 1 week? 1 month? I encourage you not to extend your horizon past 3 months, because beyond that, you're in vision territory. If it takes you that long, it's likely there's so much you don't know and so much you have to learn along the way, and so many iterations to get you there, that setting a quantifiable target can actually get in your way by blocking alternative creative ideas from consideration. So once more, go ahead and pause the video and complete your target condition. Consider sharing it if you're in a group setting. Restart when you're ready for the next step. It's time to bring this all together. Remember, we're still in plan for the first 55 minutes of Einstein's hour. Problem analysis is also known as root cause analysis, and it's where the problem-solving rubber meets the road. We're not going to go into significant detail in this exercise, but remember this statement. Use the simplest tool that will show cause and effect down to root cause. The rigor you apply here must be relative to the situation, and it also may be related to the type of problem you're trying to solve. Is it simple, complicated, complex, or chaotic? There are a large number of tools that might help you better understand the current condition, depending on the nature of the problem you're trying to solve. This can possibly lead you into the territory of deep scientific investigation, and at some point it may make sense to call in the data and analysis experts to help you. With your A3, at this point you can make an informed case on why that might be worthwhile to do. We'll explore a few of these tools briefly, but not in great detail. I'll provide tips for additional learning for each. For example, there's the very simple icebreaker 5 whys method that we discussed in depth in the Fundamentals of Value Stream Flow Chalk Talk. 5 whys is so simple it might become a habit, and you don't need any tools, just ask why. But you need to remember to do it in a quiet, humble, curious way. It's very easy to ask why with an aggressive tone, forcing the other person into a defensive posture. Game over. When you see a problem, this is your chance to practice go see, ask why, show respect. When you get your first response, it may just be a reflex. You're hearing the story that person has been telling themselves over and over. So ask why again and again, and watch the clouds part and the sun shine in. When you reach what you feel may be the final why, you may have found a root cause, if it's a simple linear problem. Or it might be what's called a proximate or a related cause, but it may not be a root cause. Or it may be just a symptom of the problem. In any case, can you find evidence for it? They're all clues in the current condition detective game that will help you find root causes so you can decide where to put your effort in problem solving. As simple as the 5 whys method can be, you may recall in part 3 we explored ways to use it in each of the 4 Cuneiform problem types. A linear deep dive directly to the root cause may be enough with what we call a 10-minute problem. In a complicated situation, 5 whys may be a good start to help the team sort out the problem and prepare for a more rigorous analysis. They might cycle through the 5 whys routine several times, each time starting over at the top with a new possible cause, and drill that one down. After a while, they'll have a set of deep linear dives that, put together, might be useful in creating a fishbone causality diagram, which we'll explore in a few minutes. And in a complex scenario, creative use of 5 whys may also be a good tool in a very fuzzy situation, probing for outlier scenarios that are easily overlooked. And in a chaotic situation, a leader performing triage in a critical situation may start with a small team using 5 whys to quickly consider various scenarios for swift action. Once the situation is stabilized, then the leader can hand the situation back to the team to start unpacking it. So you see, even a method as simple as 5 whys can be adapted to each problem type. It's simple, you can do it anytime, no tools required. Another popular and very simple tool to break the ice and unpack the problem further is brainstorming, or my favorite version of it, which is sticky storming. We covered this in the Quickstart Kanban training video. Here it is again briefly. Gather everyone in front of a blank wall. Make sure they all have a pad of stickies and a pen. No talking. Everyone takes a few minutes to privately write down every problem they can think of on individual sticky notes. Then, all at once, everyone puts their stickies up on the wall like a blizzard of paper. This is the storm. Now you can start talking. What do you see? Does anything surprise you? Ask questions, clarify, laugh, cry. Now that you've identified the problem, start grouping the stickies. Once you've grouped them, you may see patterns emerge. If you need more rigor, making deeper cause and effect connections among the ideas and the patterns that you see, you'll need to keep going. What do I mean by keep going? You may recall in part 2 we discussed cascading A3s, problems that break down into smaller problems. Some of these problems may actually be symptoms, outcomes, not causes. Others may be proximate causes, they're close by. You're searching for root causes, like we mentioned in a Pareto analysis. If you solve one of those, many of the symptoms and proximate causes simply evaporate. So how do you sort these all out? Here's a basic fishbone problem-solving diagram, also called an Ishikawa diagram, named after the scientist who invented it. The head of the fish identifies the problem you're trying to solve, the effect. The bones are categories and their contents are the potential causes. These may come directly from your sticky storm category, or they may need more organization. The traditional fishbone categories are the 4 M's that were used in manufacturing: man, machine, materials, and methods. This example I'm showing is a more appropriate and flexible way to any setting, in my opinion. Skills and people issues, process and policy issues, organization and management issues, information issues in a free category. Or make up your own if it seems more appropriate to the situation. Your only limitation is wall space. It's important to note that we're using visualization as a tool to help unlock the power of our minds to see hidden patterns and intuit connections. It often leads a team to creative insights and ways to improve the situation. Here's an example of a fishbone from a risk assessment by a civil airport. It looks at all the potential causes for an airplane to overshoot the runway on landing. This gave designers ideas for improving safety as they plan changes to their airport. Note the categories are appropriate to this problem: environmental conditions, aircraft performance characteristics, runway conditions, and human factors. There's one thing to note about the fishbone. It's a list of potential causes, but it doesn't necessarily help you see the connections among them and help you prioritize which causes to explore to find what causes. Many causes may be related, and sometimes a team will highlight combinations of causes that appear in certain scenarios, or use special colored dots or pen markings on the stickies to connect them together to see how they're related. With complicated, complex, or chaotic scenarios, this can get really messy. Multivariate problems are that way. The final problem analysis technique we'll explore for now, until I add more in the future, is causal loop analysis. You may recall in part 1 I showed an example with a complex environmental situation. Causal loop analysis is a high dive into the deep end of the pool of multivariate problem analysis, which means understanding the causality and interactions of many variables, like billiard balls bouncing off each other on a pool table. I'm showing you this method just so you're aware it exists with a basic idea of how it works. As always, I've left you a learning tip for more if you like. It is possible for you to teach yourself this method step by step, starting simply and adding layers one by one. The rules are very logical, but often the complex and chaotic situations contain relationships that are not so logical, and plenty of judgment is required along the way to sort things out. It will take time and effort, and you'll experience many dead ends, but it's an amazing way to learn the tool and unpack a big, hairy problem at the same time. I encourage you, if you're going to do this, to find someone to play a coach so they can provide feedback and ask you probing questions along the way. In simple terms, there are reinforcing loops and balancing loops. Think of them as polarities in a battery. There are positive and negative forces. A reinforcing loop propagates the effect of a variation of any variable through the loop and returns it to reinforce the initial deviation. In other words, the loop reinforces itself. If it's a plus, it returns a stronger plus. Here's a simple causal loop analyzing chickens crossing the road. The reinforcing loop is when more chickens produce more eggs, which become more chickens that cross the road. A balancing loop takes the variation in any variable and propagates it through the loop and returns it as opposite to the initial value. In other words, it introduces a negative force that balances or counteracts the initial positive in the reinforcing loop. In this case with the balancing loop, if there are more roads to cross, this causes fewer chickens left to cross them, which means there are fewer chickens to lay eggs, so there are fewer chickens that are left to cross the road. Got it? A causal loop diagram has many rules to govern how they're drawn, and they can get quite complicated. Here are a few more rules to show the next elaboration. Here's an illustration of how failure demand works. Errors in dispensing medications in a pharmacy create a reinforcing loop that increases the amount of rework resulting from those errors, which leads to conditions where more new errors are then created by the overloaded pharmacists. If you were looking to improve this situation, you might try to introduce a balancing loop in the medication filling process to reduce the number of errors. But in a complex situation like this, the moment you tamper with any single variable, that's likely to cause unforeseeable effects elsewhere in the complex system that may create new problems. That's why you have a model, to help you try to understand when something like that happens and figure out what to do about it. An elaborate causal loop analysis can be a work of art, and it can take a tremendous amount of thought and analysis, and it can never be complete or final, because such problems are always dynamic, always changing. Once the causal loop hypotheses are identified, data can be gathered and experiments can be conducted. The beauty of this sort of diagram, and yes, I do think they're beautiful, in the same way as a great piece of music or other work of art, is that it communicates something simply that no amount of words can do. And our brains have the amazing ability to make sense of these patterns in very deep thinking ways. If you encounter a situation that deserves this degree of rigor, hopefully you can make a value-based case to bring the right resources together and devote the amount of effort required. Back to the statement, use the simplest tool that will show cause and effect down to root cause. Now we're ready for the next step in your exercise, to reach a set of potential causes to explore so you can prioritize and begin testing them. Here's a potential approach to explore using the methods you've just learned about. First, start with a sticky storm of possible causes, then group them. Then, take a few good candidates and run through 5 whys with each of them. Finally, plot your results on a fishbone. There's a blank fishbone template included in the downloadable tools, or just use a blank sheet of paper. Now look at the resulting fishbone carefully. A few additional possible causes may occur to you, so write them down as well. Now step back and look at the overall situation. Really reflect on it. Ask yourself what type of problem it is: simple, complex, complicated, or chaotic. What do you think the next step should be? Are you close to a root cause? How do you prove it? If it's a simple situation, the hypothesis to consider testing may show itself by starting with a thought experiment. Work the most likely 5 whys causality chain in reverse, from the bottom back to the top, and see what steps you might test to eliminate the source of the problem from happening and the potential effect. Is the problem not that simple? Do you need a deeper analysis? More data? Do you need to chunk the problem up into smaller parts? Has the scope of the problem suddenly grown larger as you look more deeply into it? Do you need to get more people involved? If you have someone available to help you, at least get their beginner's mind view of what you have so far. So pause the video, finish this, and restart when you're ready. We've now reached the end of the problem analysis section. Although we haven't spent much time describing these tools, it should be obvious how important this step is and how sophisticated these tools can become when you need them. You're welcome to continue your exercise on your own if you like, exploring more problem analysis tools. Here's a learning link to the American Society for Quality website, which has vast online resources. Many are free if you create an account. But remember, it's best to use the simplest method possible and not get lost in too many details. Just as I mentioned at the conclusion of part 1 about analysis paralysis, some people have a tendency to go overboard. A skilled scientist may be able to isolate a variable that unlocks the puzzle quickly. How do we learn how to do that? Now let's move from our list of potential causes to a plan for experimentation that will prioritize what we test, plan how we test and measure it, hopefully leading to a solution to our problem. Around 250 BC, Archimedes, the Greek scientist, said, "Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world." 2,000 years later, an Italian economist named Vilfredo Pareto suggested something similar, that the most focused 20% of your effort produces 80% of the result. They were both talking about leverage, how to yield the greatest change with the least effort. Root causes are that lever. When you eliminate a root cause, it will instantly and dramatically change the entire situation. The best root cause analysis means nothing if we don't design simple experiments to test and validate them in order to decide the right course of action to take. So now I'm going to share one simple approach to prioritization that I've used many times with great success. All you need is a large sheet of paper or a whiteboard and a pen. It's called the Impact Ease Matrix. Rather than explain this to you, let's do this together. Take a blank sheet of paper and draw this grid. The first column should be problem. The second column is impact. The third column is ease, and the fourth column is rank. Then write all of your problems on this grid. Just put the names in the first column. Pause the video and do this, then press start again. Now we're going to do some ranking. Whether you're working by yourself or with a team, it's very important to follow these instructions carefully. You'll understand why when we're done. First, working down the impact column, rank the potential impact of solving that particular problem from 1 to 5. In this column, 5 means it would have the highest impact. Then go back to the top of the impact column and go down a second time, adjusting your rankings from the first pass to make them all seem balanced and fairly ranked. Why do you go down the column twice? Because the first time through, you're only partway down before you even have a sense of what the rankings really mean. So on your second pass, it helps you calibrate the entire list more consistently. Now do the same 2 passes down the ease column. This time the easiest will be a 5 and the hardest will be a 1. It's very important that you do not extend the numbers across the rows into the final column until you're complete with the second pass of the ease column. Why? If you or the team you're leading through this exercise start totaling each line as you go, there's a natural tendency to start modifying your answers to fit the ranking you may already have in your head. That's called gaming or tampering with the list. Finally, when you've done 2 passes on both the impact and ease columns, now multiply the numbers across. Now study and reflect on the results. What do they mean? So pause the video, go ahead and do these steps and reflect on the results, then press start to continue. Here's a useful visual pattern to help you interpret your results and develop a prioritized plan to move forward. If you have any problems in the upper right quadrant, high impact and easy, you may want to do them right away. If you have a perfect 25, do it now, perhaps even before you leave the room, if you all agree on it. The quick wins, easy but with low impact, are worth doing when you have time to fit them in. The high impact but hard ones may be saved until later, but eventually you may need to do them, chunk them up, and get started. The lower left quadrant contains the hardest and lowest impact problems. Why would you ever do those? Now that we've charted out impact and ease, there's one more prioritization step you may consider: interdependencies and sequencing. When you have an interdependency, some problems, even if they're lower impact, may need to be done first because other higher impact problems will be easier to fix once you've gotten these problems out of the way. This might include problems in the upper left quadrant that need to be done first. Another way to look for sequencing is upstream and downstream in the process flow. Fixing a problem at the beginning of a process generally has a greater impact. It magnifies and frees up downstream problems, or perhaps eliminates them entirely. When that happens, the downstream problem turns out to be a symptom caused by the upstream problem. So always build quality into the process as early as possible. Here are the results when the anonymous large NGO went through their impactees analysis. Remember, the core problem they were trying to solve was inconsistency among their divisions, and the process they chose to tackle first was the grant writing and proposal process. Rather than tell you what they learned, pause the video and take a few moments to study and reflect on this. Once you're done studying this example, go ahead and visualize the impactees outcomes for your own exercise and see what priorities and sequencing appears. I'll be waiting for you so we can finish the exercise. We're now in the home stretch, approaching how Einstein said he would use the last 5 minutes of his allotted hour. We're going to design the first experiment we've prioritized. In order to do that, we need to do two other things first. We need to understand what it means to do an experiment. Then we need to understand how to develop a working hypothesis so we can conduct a valid and useful experiment to move you forward a step. So what does experiment really mean? To some people, and in some organization cultures, the words hypothesis and experiment are used in a casual fashion, often simply to justify undisciplined or random activity. In many cases, people will argue that they're too busy, so they can't make the time to do what needs to be done to improve the processes, to slow down for a little while so they can go faster, even though they may clearly understand that excessive waste and failure demand may be what's making them too busy in the first place. In some cases, they just don't know how to do what needs to be done to improve the process. But why don't they make time to learn? Because they're too busy. So let's review this progression of cause and effect. Why are they too busy? Because of all the waste and failure demand in how they do the work. Why is there so much waste and failure demand? Because they haven't fixed it. Why haven't they fixed it? Because they don't know how. Why don't they know how? Because they're too busy to learn. And the 5 whys circles back to the beginning. Note that this isn't a linear drill down like 5 whys usually does. This is a circle. There is no start and end. If this were a causal loop analysis, this would be a balancing loop. Being too busy makes them be even more too busy in the future. The only thing for them to do is break the circuit and make time to fix it, which will start returning time back to them with the advantages of higher quality and delivery responses, which leads to happy customers. But the team has to pay it forward. So the circle brings us back once again to the question, what is a good experiment and how do we do it quickly and iteratively? Experiment is not throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks. In plan, do, check, act, if all you do is do again and again without check and act, you end up with a pile of doo-doo. And having spent a couple of years coaching at Nike's corporate headquarters, I can assure you their slogan was not just do it. A good experiment starts with a good hypothesis that clearly reflects the essence of the problem you're trying to solve at the moment. It should be testable and measurable, ideally done very quickly so you can learn and iterate at high velocity. The experiment also needs to be structured properly, and this can be harder than it seems. Let me give you an example, one challenge that many of us will have at some point in our lives, how to maintain a healthy body weight. A good hypothesis is not, I'll exercise more and see what happens. That's just throwing something on a wall. If you're a very disciplined person by nature, this might work, but don't count on it sticking. A step in the right direction of a good hypothesis would be, if I exercise more, then I'll lose weight, but you have no baseline data to measure against. Another step in the right direction might be, if I exercise 1 hour a day and my baseline now is 0 exercise, then in a week I should lose 5 pounds. This is your first experiment, so your hypothesis that you should lose 5 pounds is just an estimate, or you may say it was a guess. But you have to start somewhere. If at the end of the week you've met your exercise target but only lost 2 pounds, now you have baseline data, and your next experiment could be, if I exercise an hour and a half each day, then I will lose 3 pounds. Now that's a good hypothesis. It states the parameters and the target. You have baseline data. The experiment takes place in a short time, and the result is measurable. There's a lot more to forming hypotheses, especially with complicated or complex situations involving multiple variables, but we won't explore that now. Here's a learning tip if you want more. Now it's time for the last step of the exercise to plan and prepare the experiment. Take the first problem you've prioritized and develop a working hypothesis you can test. Use the form, if I do this, then this should happen. Define the baseline data you have or you need to get, the method and length of the experiment, your target result, and how you'll measure it. Press pause and restart when you're ready. We're finally ready to start the do, check, act cycle of iterative experiments. So what I have to say now might surprise you. I'm not impressed with the right side of most A3 formats I've seen. And I'm not the only one. I've heard this from a number of skilled lean coaches over the years. The left side of the A3, background, current condition, target condition, and problem analysis, are clear and crisp steps. But the moment you switch to the right side, it seems to break down and be less clear and crisp and less helpful. Here's a snapshot of the countermeasure guidelines from the A3 template we've been using. While everything it says here is accurate, it doesn't offer much guidance as to how to move forward with cycles of experimentation that are appropriate to each situation, other than to use a Gantt chart. A Gantt chart is a decades-old project management tool which is generally inadequate for wading into complex and chaotic situations with lots of change. I have my own hypothesis for why the shortcomings of the A3 exist. I believe it's lean's predisposition to standards, which causes it to be less comfortable dealing with a high degree of uncertainty. In a highly complicated situation that's standards-based, Six Sigma has a very rigorous method called design of experiments, using deep analytical methods. Here's a learning link to the American Society of Quality if you'd like to learn more. But the deeper we move into the uncertainty zone, into complexity and chaos, agile thinking and methods seem to be more helpful. I'm not dismissing lean here, I'm just pointing out an inflection point where we place more emphasis on agility. Instead of continuing with the right side of the A3, I'm going to reach into the Agile playbook and examine experiment planning and preparation with backlog management tips and some insights from the Lean Startup. Then, when we're ready for do, check, and act, we'll look at 3 scenarios using Kata, Kanban, and Scrum. A backlog is a to-do list that quickly adapts to change. It helps you be agile. The backlog is continuously reprioritized as new information flows in from all directions. The backlog can be revised during the team's daily stand-up and at any other time during the day. And the team is always in close contact with their customers, learning if there are any new priorities or shifts in their demand. This constant updating is called backlog grooming. In the Scrum method, which we'll explore soon, additional backlog management tasks occur as the team prepares for the next sprint cycle. A well-maintained backlog is ready at all times for a pull signal, so work flows into delivery and to the customer. In the context of problem solving and experimenting tasks, the backlog is always available to be reprioritized so the team can immediately pivot and respond to sudden new problems or opportunities. Now let's take a look at a few hypothesis fine-tuning tips from the popular book, The Lean Startup. The first term we'll explore is MVP, which means minimum viable product. An MVP is a very limited but fully working product delivered at the end of a sprint cycle. It could be a piece of software the customer needs, or it can be a problem that it needs to be solved. But it only meets the minimum design, so it can be done quickly, and it allows the customer to test a very precise new capability to determine if it meets their needs. A successful MVP validates the value hypothesis by asking a simple question: would the customer buy this new product? What value and experience does it deliver? The term MVP, which Eric Ries introduced in the Lean Startup, became so popular it's now used daily in agile organizations around the world. Another term popularized by the Lean Startup is pivot. While in early stages of innovation and during times of disruption, an organization may need to suddenly and radically change course if the experiment results point towards a new target state or even an entirely new product, industry, or vision. This leads to the other important term from Lean Startup, the difference between a value hypothesis and a growth hypothesis. The initial premise of the Lean Startup was to understand why so many internet startup companies in Silicon Valley ran out of money before they became a viable company. Eric's conclusion was too many companies pursued the growth hypothesis enthusiastically but prematurely before they determined they had a solid value hypothesis, that there were actually customers that would want to buy their product in the first place. The lesson to remember here is don't get impatient with the problem-solving process and skip ahead to solutions you want or where you think the problem is leading you, like you're going to grow this and how successful it's going to be. If you don't prove your value hypothesis first by focusing on customer value and experience, you're likely going to be trapped in a dead end of waste of time and energy. Here's a learning tip to a YouTube by Eric Ries with an overview of the Lean Startup. Now it's time to complete your experiment and then to close this training series, where we'll explore 3 scenarios for future experimentation. First, let's complete your experiment. If you chose an easy problem, you might complete it right now. If you chose a hard one, it may require some planning and preparation. In any case, here are some basic steps you might consider following. Go ahead and finish now or later, and I'll proceed with the final topic for this session. Different do, check, act experimentation scenarios require varying degrees of planning and management effort. So to conclude this session, I'm going to explore 3 flow scenarios for different types of problems in different settings. I'll also use this opportunity to share an overview of the Kata problem-solving pattern and a brief comparison of the Kanban and Scrum workflow methods, because I feel they're very useful for NGOs and nonprofits to understand. The first scenario is a simple single team situation pursuing incremental improvement, performing individual experiments one at a time along with their other daily work activities. This team will use the Kata method, tracking activity with a Kanban board. The second is a more ambitious single team scenario, pursuing a larger improvement initiative towards an ambitious target state, where they may be working on several problems during the same time period. The team treats this effort as a project rather than a daily series of sequential experiments. This team will use Scrum to guide and track their experimentation. The third is a multi-team scenario, pursuing an improvement effort involving problems and changes that cascade across the organization. These efforts must be coordinated among the teams, so they'll use multi-team scaled Scrum to guide and track their experimentation. Here's a summary of Scenario 1. Now let's briefly explore how the Kata method works. The Kata method assumes the presence of a skilled coach that moves around the organization each day, spending a dedicated amount of time helping each team. The coach helps the team work through the problem-solving process each day. You'll note this 4-step process: understand the direction, grasp the current condition, establish the next target condition, and experiment towards it. Follow the A3 pattern. Teams use a Kata storyboard instead of the traditional A3 storyboard template, and this visual management tool helps the team track, measure, and manage each step. The team usually has a visual wall with additional supporting materials, such as a Kanban board to track their regular daily workflow, problem analysis details, and so on. Here are 2 learning tips if you're interested in learning more on Kata. Both are YouTube videos presented by Mike Rother. Here's a simple Kanban board containing all the work the team is doing, problem-solving experiments, and everything else, moving through the daily progression of being pulled from the backlog into to-do, through doing, and done. If it was helpful, the team could use a different color of note to represent each type of work. Or they could group them into swim lanes, so at any time they can see the balance of their time with each type of work and quickly spot problems. Here's a stylized depiction of Scenario 1 that we'll use for comparison with the other 2 scenarios, which I'll share in a moment. The team starts with a problem analysis. They prioritize and sequence the problems and experiments. They update their backlog. Problem solving, along with all other work, is pulled through their Kanban each day, which helps keep all their work flowing smoothly. After each experiment and at the end of each day, they measure the result, reflect on what they've learned, and update the backlog for the next day. Before moving to scenarios 2 and 3, let's take a look at the basic similarities and differences between Kanban and Scrum. Both Kanban and Scrum visualize workflow, use a prioritized backlog, and carefully regulate the amount of work in process to ensure the work flows steadily and the team doesn't get overloaded with work backing up, causing delays and quality problems. Kanban is essentially one-piece workflow, where teams maintain a steady workload, and every time they complete a task, they pull a new one from the backlog, which keeps the daily work in process at a manageable level. Scrum treats work as a project, broken into rapid iterative cycles called sprints, which are usually about 2 weeks long. The sprint is fed by a sprint backlog, which is derived from the overall backlog at the beginning of each sprint cycle through the sprint planning process. Just like Kanban, the team manages work in process carefully, estimating the amount of work and the sequencing and interdependencies of the tasks they put into each sprint backlog. Kanban is quite simple and easy to learn and use with very little training, where Scrum roles and steps are more elaborate and require learning and guidance to use them properly. I've seen both be highly effective in NGO and nonprofit operations. If you're interested in learning more about these 2, here's a fabulous comparison that I've shared for many years. It may be more of a deep dive comparison than a casual practitioner would appreciate, but it's worth taking a look. This document can be difficult to find through Google, so I've included it in the Lean Agile NGO library. Follow the specific link to get there. Sorry it's so long. I've also included a link to the Scrum Guide published by Scrum Inc., the creators of the Scrum method. Here are illustrations of a Kanban and a Scrum board side by side. The flow of both Kanban and Scrum are adapted to the nature of the workflow. In this case, I've pasted suggested do, check, act steps into the Scrum board columns to show you how it might look when you use Scrum to manage a problem-solving project. Now here's a summary of scenario 2. Let's briefly explore how the Scrum method works compared to Kanban. Here's a depiction of scenario 2 using Scrum. Just like scenario 1, the team starts with a problem analysis. Then they prioritize and sequence the problems and experiments and update their backlog. The team then plans the next sprint cycle using input from the previous sprint, estimating the amount of time and effort required for each step to ensure the sprint contains an appropriate amount of work to keep it flowing. Then they conduct the sprint cycle with daily stand-ups. As they learn more about the problem, they continuously update the problem analysis and groom the backlog for the next sprint cycle. Nearing the end of the sprint cycle, they begin estimating and planning for the next sprint and starting a deeper analysis of the problems to be included in the next cycle so they can be prepared for it. At the end of this sprint, they do a thorough retrospective to understand what they learned, what problems they encountered, and how to improve their next sprint cycle, both the content of the sprint, the work they're doing, and the process, the way they're conducting the sprint cycle. So with every cycle of the sprint, they improve both the product they're producing and they improve their learning about how to use Scrum more effectively. Finally, here's a summary of scenario 3 with multiple teams working on a single improvement initiative. Note the coordination of team backlogs, sprint activities, daily stand-ups, product backlog, and Scrum process retrospectives and improvements require more guidance and support. Here's a depiction of scenario 3 with multiple teams working on the same problem. At the individual team level, nothing changes. From the multi-team Scrum flow perspective, we see problems cascading down to the individual teams. Together, these teams analyze problems, prioritizing and sequencing them. Then they're passed down to individual teams to integrate with their sprint backlogs and workflows. As the sprint cycle continues, a representative of a member from each team attends collective daily stand-ups, bringing along specific individual team members when their particular expertise or insight is useful to the collective. Nearing the end of the sprint cycle, a collective planning for the next sprint begins. At the end of the sprint cycle, each team holds their retrospective, then there's a collective retrospective. This is usually worthwhile to bring all team members into a physical or virtual room together so they contribute to and learn from the collective effort and develop working relationships with the other teams. This entire effort may be led and coordinated by one individual who in Scrum terminology is generally called the product owner. In this case, they're sometimes called the problem owner or manager when Scrum is used to manage problem-solving efforts. There's one more thing I want to mention here before completing, because it can be very important to some people in certain situations. Note the cascading approach shown here appears very similar to the Hoshin-Conry cascading lean management system and the popular OKR method I described in part 2. That's not just a coincidence. In the Agile world, there are several popular scaled Agile management system approaches known as the Scaled Agile Framework, or SAFe, large-scale Scrum, or less, and Scrum of Scrums. These all originated with Hoshin Kanri and essentially work in the same way, so they integrate well with an overall organization that's using Hoshin Kanri. Now I'm going to offer a similar caution about Scaled Agile and Scrum frameworks that I shared about the OKR method in Part 2. Any organization that adopts one of these frameworks should also adopt the essential mindset of team autonomy with catchball target setting, problem solving, and learning cycles. Any organization that adopts these frameworks in a top-down reward and punishment style is using the tool improperly, repeating old command and control mindset and behaviors in a shiny new way. In the past few minutes, I've shared a rapid overview of Kata, Kanban, and Scrum in the context of problem solving. There's a lot here to absorb, and I only expect you to see the basic patterns and understand what these tools are all about. I've provided plenty of learning tips to help guide you forward. In the future, I'll be creating a special Scrum training session for NGOs and nonprofits. I felt it was appropriate to close this problem-solving session with this overview because to be effective, you must make problem-solving approaches and workflows help each team and not get in their way. In my experience, these tools, especially Kanban and Scrum in general, beyond problem solving to all kinds of work, are very effective in NGO and nonprofit organizations, both at the headquarters level and on the front lines. I want to thank you for your time and attention to this in-depth training series. I've put the effort into this, making it free to whomever wishes to watch and learn from it, simply because we're all now facing the most difficult problems on the planet. These problems won't be easy to solve, and with the way things are changing, they won't stay solved for long. So NGOs and nonprofits working globally and locally must continue to learn and adapt, and they must learn to do it together in partnership with governments and private industry and with local communities and volunteers around the globe. We must all choose our next steps very carefully since there's little margin for error for our planet and all living on it. So congratulations, you finished the Quickstart Problem Solving Training Series. I hope you'll take an opportunity to communicate back with me with any suggestions on what you'd change, how to make it better for the next people to come along. I want to leave you with some words of encouragement. Learning problem solving individually, at the team, or at the organization level, like anything else worth doing, takes time, patience, and most of all, practice. We learn by doing, by building cognitive connections and muscle memory. So take your time, do the work, and stick with it. You've got this.